Hi, Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, and we're having a special Memorial Day edition, so happy Memorial Day. And today we're going to be discussing 6 martyrs of the American Revolution. Now, I do want to note, on Memorial Day, there were thousands of soldiers in the American Revolutionary War who did die, and they should all be honored today, but we don't really have time to go through all of those lives, so I'm going to talk about just 6 of the many men who were killed and thought of as martyrs in their own day during the Revolutionary War. So let's get started. First of all, we're going to talk about Christopher Cedar, Christopher Cedar was actually a boy, and this is before the American Revolutionary War, back in 1770. You see, people at that point were angry at the tax collectors in Boston, and there was a gentleman who was a customs agent named Ebenezer Richardson. What better villain name than Ebenezer Richardson? So, the people of Boston formed a mob and went to his house and started kicking in his doors, and Richardson was actually scared for his life and for his family's lives. So he fired a shot out of his window, and unfortunately for him, and even more unfortunately for Christopher Cedar, it hit Christopher Cedar and killed him. And Christopher was somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12. We're not entirely sure, but he was not quite a teenager, that is for certain. And when he was killed, a big deal was made of this. And as you can see next to me, he is buried alongside members of the Boston Massacre. Interestingly, Cedar dies, and Sam Adams organizes a big funeral in his honor. And just 11 days after that funeral, there's again a mob and another shooting, and that becomes the Boston Massacre. So Cedar's death is actually very similar to how the massacre went down, and only about 2 weeks beforehand. And in a fashion, he might be considered the first casualty of the Revolutionary War. So moving on, and we're going chronologically right now, we're going to move on to Richard Montgomery. This is one of the names you might actually know. You see, Richard Montgomery had fought in the British Army and then moved to New York and just started living a luxurious life when the American Revolutionary War breaks out. And Montgomery is slow to take up arms because, as I said, he was just in the British Army a few years beforehand, but the people of New York call on him and ask him to go serve in the provincial assembly that took over after New York's government was canceled, and Montgomery does this because his neighbors asked him to, and then he is recruited into the Continental Army, and he is immediately selected as a brigadier general in the Continental Army, and he serves under Major General Philip Schuyler in New York. Now, when the first invasion in 1775 of Canada is launched, well, Philip Schuyler, for various reasons, can't make the trip, and Richard Montgomery is sent in his stead. And during this time, he is promoted to Major General in the Continental Army, and he successfully invades Canada. He takes Montreal, he leads the army all the way up to Quebec City, where he meets up with then American hero Benedict Arnold, who had just traveled through the woods of Maine. They meet in Quebec City, and they begin to siege the city, and they invade it, and unfortunately, almost as soon as they walk in, Richard Montgomery is shot in the head. And right after that, Benedict Arnold is shot, and they are both taken from the scene, and what was hopefully going to be a quick invasion of this city ends up being a siege that lasts for several months until Johnny Burgoyne shows up with the British reinforcements and drives the Americans, who were also suffering from smallpox, out of Canada. Montgomery at this point becomes a martyr to the cause. He's really one of the first, after Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the first major military men of the Continental Army whose death becomes a rallying cry of the American Revolution. Next up, we have Hugh Mercer. Now, Hugh Mercer was actually a physician who had fled from Scotland early in life after a failed attempt to remove the King of England. He flees to Scotland, but he does end up fighting with the British Army in the 7 Years' War. He becomes very important in western Pennsylvania. He helps set up what we now know as Pittsburgh. He built some of the first buildings there, which at that point was called Fort Pitt. And then when the Revolutionary War breaks out, he joins the cause, and Mercer becomes head, he also is a brigadier general, and he becomes head of the flying camp. Now, if the flying camp was similar to what the Minutemen were for state militias, especially in New England, the flying camp was expected to be able to move at a moment's notice. If you called in the flying camp, snap, they should go and be able to move before, armies moved fairly slowly, especially back then when they were on foot and maybe horseback, but Mercer's men were supposed to move quickly. And they did. So unfortunately for Mercer, as with everyone else we're discussing today, he does not survive this story. He ends up crossing the Delaware with George Washington. And then when they're moving between Princeton and Trenton, along the way, Mercer's men are attacked. They're ambushed by the British, and Mercer is severely wounded. Now, he's actually propped up on a tree in New Jersey, and his men want to remove him from the field, but he says, no, I want to stay and lead the men. Fairly reminiscent of General Herkimer in New York, who we're not talking about today, but another person you should definitely honor on Memorial Day. But Mercer's propped up on a tree, and he continues to lead his men, and he dies soon thereafter. And actually, the Mercer tree remained in New Jersey for over 200 years as a memorial to him, the tree that he was propped up on. Unfortunately, about 15 years ago, a storm did blow it down. You know, trees do age and they get blown down. But we do definitely want to remember General Hugh Mercer this Memorial Day. Now we're going to get into some characters that you probably have not heard about, like William Ledyard. We're moving along now, and when George Washington finally decides to move his main army from the mid-Atlantic down to Yorktown, well, the British don't want him to go, and they try and trick him into staying in New York. And the way they do this is they attack Connecticut, because they think, hey, when George Washington hears about attacking Connecticut, he'll stop going to Yorktown, where Burgoyne has been trapped at this point. I'm sorry, Cornwallis has been trapped at this point, and he will return north to Connecticut. Unfortunately for them, George Washington doesn't return, and even more unfortunately for William Ledyard, he's the one who gets attacked. So William Ledyard has two forts he's commanding in just outside of New London, Connecticut. And next to me, there is no picture of William Ledyard, but this is the Thames River in Connecticut, and he has a fort on each side of this river. The British go up. At this point, former American hero Benedict Arnold is now leading a British force. He goes up one side of the river, and Ledyard is in the fort on the other side. Now, the Americans actually do a fantastic job, despite overwhelming British numbers. They do a great job of holding off the British of getting into the fort. They even kill one of the leading officers of the British and severely wound his subordinate. So the commanding officers of the attacking British are taken out of the fight pretty early, but still, eventually, a captain does take over. They do get into the fort because they have overwhelming numbers. And when they do, Ledyard puts down his weapons. He tells his men to disarm and surrender. Now, when they ask who has control of this fort, he said, I did, but now you do. And he hands his sword to the captain, who has now taken over the fort. And that gentleman is not such a gentleman, and he takes Ledyard's sword and stabs him with it and kills him, and they slaughter most of the Americans in the fort. It's called the Battle of Groton Heights, and it is one of the largest massacres in the Northeast during the American Revolutionary War. And I'll remind you, this is just weeks before the Americans win the victory at Yorktown. I should say months before, about 3 months before the actual victory at Yorktown. On that note, there is another martyr in South Carolina, Isaac Hayden. Isaac Hayden was a lower-level member of the militia, but he had served for several years, and eventually, unfortunately, he is taken capture by the enemy. Now, the war looked like it was coming to an end. At this point, Washington is marching towards Yorktown, and as I said, Cornwallis is essentially trapped there. And the British don't want to have to hold as many prisoners as they have. So they actually release Isaac Hayden on parole, and they send him home. And this is great news for Hayden because his family had been sick. They had caught smallpox. Several of his children had already died. A few more of his family members would die also. He goes home to take care of them. The British, however, they end up coming and knocking, and they say, hey, listen, we know that you're on parole. Can you sign this loyalty oath to the king? Now, this was common at the time, and many people did what Hayden did. He was a patriot and had served with the Patriots and wanted to stick with the Patriots, but his family needed him at home, and he was either going to be brought into prison or sign this oath whether he meant it or not. Though this is a point in time where people's honor were very important, he was more of a regular person as far as officers in the militia go, so Hayden actually does sign the loyalty oath, and they have a handshake agreement saying, okay, you've signed this oath, now you do not have to participate in the war. We just don't want you to all of a sudden be fighting against us, the British. A few days later, the British come back and they say, we've changed our mind. We need you to join the British Army right now. And Hayden says, no. And he runs away. He runs back to the Patriot side. Now, he hadn't been serving with the Patriots because he had signed this loyalty oath. But he felt, and this is a common occurrence at the time throughout the South, he felt that his parole had been violated when they attempted to recruit him or impress him into the army. So he leaves and he goes back to the Patriot side and he starts fighting. Now, he ends up getting captured again, and I'm not going to get too much into that story. It involves Andrew Williamson, who was actually acting as a double agent for the Americans at the time. Hayden captures him, fearing that Williamson will be hung or tried for whatever reason. The British go out and try and help Williamson. During the process, they capture Hayden. Now, Hayden, from their perspective, is a traitor. He signed the loyalty oath, they let him on parole, and he's broken his parole, and he is hung. Without a trial, without anything. They just string him up and hang him. This is the closest image I have to the hanging. I don't think it's exactly right. I think it came at a much later date as opposed to contemporary resource, but this is the closest image we're going to get of Isaac Hayden. Anyway, Hayden is hung, and he, coupled with William Ledyard, who we just spoke about, both word arrives of both of these deaths to Yorktown about the same time, just as the Americans are starting to take over. They go in, and the names Hayden and Ledyard become rallying cries, although more Groton than Ledyard, which Groton was the battle. It's the place that the battle took. But still, Ledyard's essence and the name of Isaac Hayden are used as rallying cries. In fact, there's even claims made that Marquis de Lafayette said something along the lines of, let's do this for Isaac Hayden, when he led his famous charge during the Battle of Yorktown. There is one last founder we are going to remember on this Memorial Day, and his name is Nathaniel Scrudder. You see, even though the battle had been focused on Yorktown and everything seemed to be coming in on Yorktown, there were still skirmishes around the colonies, at this point, the states. Now, Nathaniel Scrudder is one of the more interesting characters because Nathaniel Scrudder was also a physician who had served in the local militia. He had been on his committee of safety. He joined the Continental Army as a lieutenant colonel, and then he was elected to the Continental Congress. And he had Nathaniel Scrudder signed the Articles of Confederation, and then went back to fight in the war. And even though Yorktown was happening, the Battle of Yorktown, the Siege of Yorktown, took several weeks, and it was at the same time they were sieging Yorktown that Nathaniel Scrudder was on a foraging mission, and he and his small band got into a little minor insignificant skirmish in New Jersey, and Nathaniel Scrudder was killed. And Nathaniel Scrudder, what makes him stand out is he was the only active member of the Continental Congress to be killed in battle. By which I mean, he was technically still a delegate to the Congress when he was killed in this skirmish in New Jersey. So that is the last of our founders today. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely hit like and make sure you subscribe. I talked about the American Revolution all week long. Usually we focus on one founder or one event and not jumping around like this, but it's Memorial Day and I wanted to squeeze in as many people that we can remember as possible. Thank you so much for watching, and I will be back with just one founder for you tomorrow.